trees, and the leaves are falling to the ground. The wind is blowing through the leaves on the trees, and now I'm waiting for a little bit of sunshine, but the sun is shining through, and the sun is shining through. Yesterday was a bad day because my love disappeared, and now I'm waiting for a little bit of sunshine, and the wind is blowing through the leaves on the trees, and now I'm sitting by my window on my own, but the sun is shining through, and the sun is shining through, and the sun is shining through, and the sun is shining through.
Welcome back. And zou de muziek even af mogen? Fantastic. Okay. I heard a lot of people were already humming and buzzing and making cross references. So I hope this is an atmosphere we can keep on going. And I think that Daniel Barber gave a very beautiful sort of wrap up for questioning basically the nature of knowledge. And this is the topic of the second panel discussion. And since we are in a hasty modus, I will keep it very, very shortly. Because this panel is being hosted by, let me get the little clicker out, Sergio Figueroa. I know, my gosh, I'm always struggling. We know each other, and I happily can also say Sergio. Who is an architect, author, curator, and historian. He's an assistant professor of architecture history and theory at the TU in Eindhoven, where he also founded the Curatorial Research Collective, the CRC. He's also the chair of ODE, the research committee, and the coordinator of research seminars in architecture and urbanism. But since we are here at this particular building, I wanted to reference that your PhD was actually on this building where I spent 9 years of my formative life, or professional life, I should say, which was entitled The NAI Effect. I would say we need to write the next chapter soon, but thank you very much for taking up our invitation to moderate this panel, and look forward to your introduction. Please give it up to Sergio Figueroa. Yeah?
Thank you. Yes, hi. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this second panel discussion, or second session of this IABR symposium on the nature of knowledge, as Saskia just mentioned. We had some incredible conversations in the first session, and as Saskia already mentioned, that first session ended with this provocation from Daniel of how do we instigate a radical change in architectural education that can foster a radical change in architectural practice and the profession. And that is more or less the topic that we'll be engaging with in this session. So for this session, we'll be focusing in general terms in the broadening of knowledge in architectural education, but also its impact in practice. So with this session, we aim to explore how architectural education can integrate a wider range of knowledge systems and pedagogical approaches to not only better serve students, but also to influence the future of architectural practice, as well as the future of the spaces that we inhabit. As architectural educators, we must ask ourselves, what knowledge are we teaching and how are we teaching it? So the questions we explore in this session go beyond, let's say, the mere mechanics of delivering a professional degree. Since formal education is the pipeline to architectural practice, the way we educate today will shape the future of the profession. And this is particularly important in a field like architecture, where academic training has been closely tied to professional practice. But does this relationship between education and practice limit our ability to rethink how architecture is taught? Should education not only respond to practice, but also have the power to influence and direct it? Historically, the professional aspects of architectural education have unfortunately taken precedence over academic inquiry. The focus has been on equipping students with the practical skills necessary for professional accreditation, often at the expense of encouraging critical thinking and creativity, or perhaps, even more crucially, at the expense of an actual engagement with broader social, environmental, and cultural concerns. Yet, as our world faces increasing challenges, from climate change to social inequality, architecture needs to evolve, and so does architectural education. One of the core questions we must address is how can architecture education embrace varied forms of knowledge and practices beyond the traditional architectural canon? This challenge is at the heart of the work of today's speakers, each of whom advocates for a broadening of architectural knowledge in a very distinctive way. So Sophie Pelsmaker's work is a prime example of this shift. With her initiative, Arc for Change, she has advocated for a climate emergency curriculum that places sustainability, restorative design, and climate justice at the heart of architectural education, a work that she continues now at Tampere University in Finland, where she co-chairs the Sustainable Housing Design Research Group. Her pedagogical approach not only responds to pressing global challenges, but also aims to transform the profession itself. By embedding these values early on in students' education, we can cultivate architects who will lead the way in creating a post-growth society. Likewise, Kasia Navratek's post-humanist pedagogical approach also challenges students to reconsider their role as architects. In her vertically integrated studio, she not only combines different students at different stages of their academic development, but also different types of expertise, such as architecture and landscape architecture, a plea that we have heard also in the previous session. So her current educational and research efforts follow two parallel lines of inquiry: the climate crisis response using a post-human lens in architectural education, and the application of literary methods in architectural modes of investigation. Her use of narrative and speculative methods in design helps students critically reflect on their position as creative agents. This radical shift in thinking encourages students to see themselves as part of a larger ecological and societal system rather than simply focusing on the built form. Effectively, her teaching practice is anchored in Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of polyphony, nurturing an inclusive and dialogic studio environment. Lara Schrijver's work, meanwhile, explores tacit knowledge in architectural practice and education, questioning the implicit practices that guide architectural design. She focuses on the less visible, yet equally crucial ways of knowing in architecture, drawing attention to the skills and insights that are often passed down through practice rather than formal teaching. So her work invites us to reconsider how we value and integrate this tacit knowledge into architectural education, allowing for a more comprehensive and nuanced understanding of the discipline and eventually the profession. While the work of today's speakers provides us with just a few singular examples, it nevertheless prompts us to ask, how do we create curricula that go beyond the immediate demands of practice to cultivate instead architects who can critically engage with the world around them? How can we reimagine the role of the architect to prepare students not only for today's challenge, but for a future that will likely demand new ways of thinking and new ways of working? How can we foster a more inclusive and diverse educational approach? Ultimately, how must we challenge the conventional hierarchies of knowledge production within architecture? While there is a growing recognition of the need to diversify in architectural education, we also, of course, face some constraints. So the current educational frameworks are often rigid, particularly in the push for employability metrics that prioritize professional skills over academic thought. How do we engage with these frameworks while still advocating for a broadening of knowledge? How do we balance the need to prepare students for the realities of practice while at the same time attempting to cultivate critical thinkers? These and other questions serve as a foundation for our conversation now as we examine the potential for architectural education to embrace a wider range of knowledge systems and challenge the structures that have traditionally defined our profession. Our goal is to explore how we can create educational environments that foster inclusivity, that foster innovation and critical engagement, ultimately shaping a future for architecture that is more responsive to the challenges of our time. So let's start our conversation now on how we can achieve these goals and what changes we as educators and practitioners, as schools and institutions can make to reshape education for a better future. And for that, I would like now to invite each of our speakers to present their position statements to kick off our conversation. And we'll start with Lara. Thank you.
Thank you. Where to start? Yeah, I have to, let's see. I guess that is forward? Yes. All right. So the slides I've prepared go to this issue of tacit knowledge, but maybe you'll allow me a brief introduction without images. In all honesty, I'm still mulling over this comment on the oak leaf. I think it's actually an interesting comment because it shows part of what I'm trying to show here. You can take this from a couple different sides, right? I mean, an architect doesn't know how to identify an oak leaf or distinguish it from a birch leaf. This could be a problem. It means that they don't have sufficient knowledge to deal with nature. It might also be that indeed in our curricula we haven't honored the knowledge that comes with everyday experience. Most people who grow up in the northwest of Europe can identify an oak leaf because they've sat under an oak tree with their grandmother, because they've walked through the forest with their little sister, because they've watched an acorn grow. And so in a way, if our architects don't know this, maybe they've forgotten what it was to be a person, a child, a sibling, a parent. And that, in a way, ties into my concern about tacit knowledge. It's something that I encountered in my very first stages. Véronique Pateo earlier was saying in her architecture curriculum, she remembers all this abstraction and these canonical buildings. I remember also being extremely puzzled why it was not relevant to my teachers to know how someone might feel in a specific area of the house, or why it might not be relevant how the light would fall or how it would sound. So in a way, a lot of what I was trying to communicate or trying to understand had no place in the curriculum because it didn't fit in the drawings we had learned to make. So that basically goes to a lot of the work that I've been doing in the past years, where we're talking about knowledge production as something that is either abstracted, and for those of you taking pictures, I have to highlight the mistake on this slide, because it's actually we can know more than we can tell, but in a way, because of the visual field that we are in, this often blends into a discussion with my students on how we can show more than we can tell. And that just goes to the heart of whether our knowledge is something that we abstract, that we set in encyclopedias, that we can define as objective knowledge, that we can test the material, physical calculations of whether a building will or will not fall down. Those are pretty self-evident, scientific, observable facts. And yet, the field is so much broader than that. So what I want to share with you today, what's gone into my teaching, I will be sharing slides mostly from a research network that we have a project that we have just rounded off, where we invited 10 PhD students to engage with this question of tacit knowledge and how it enriches academic inquiry. And this was a massive network. I need you to understand I'm one voice out of 10 institutions with 10 supervisors, with 3 cultural institutions, 10 architecture offices, 10 PhD candidates, and 6 advisory board members. So really, I'm just showing you a little bit of a very broad production. And that brings me back to the oak leaf, because maybe it's even more important to know that you are in a group or in a community where someone can define the oak leaf, but you might not need the knowledge yourself. So to move on, this nature of knowledge. To me, there are a few key things that we can do in architecture schools that can help our students tap into what they already know, to what they've already observed, and to develop that further in alignment with scientific and research-based inquiries. One example here is from Kendia Weinbelt, who was part of the TAC network. She was at the University of Hanover, but she was studying very deeply how perceptual understanding, experience, impressions, visuals all tie into how we understand even just a single drawing or a single photograph. And so throughout her PhD, she did these lovely watercolors where you see the structure of how she was studying cognitive science literature, how she was studying observational literature, and even experimenting with her own photographs where you get doubling perceptions. In essence, what she was constantly exercising, and what I think our students are also constantly exercising, is how do we give form to these observations? That's not just structure, it's shape, it's material, it's form, it's tangible. Another thing that was really interesting that came out of this network that I would have never considered, which is a big plug for the collaborative learning, giving presence to sensory perception. We had a PhD student who was studying the renovation of a grade school, and this renovation ran into multiple problems in Stockholm, and most of it had to do with a smell. And the smell was possibly indicative of a mold, possibly not. And so she went into this vast in-depth study of what had been measured in terms of odors, what had been found in terms of molds, what the chemical components were that were all present in this building, and whether this was okay for preschoolers to be in. And so this kind of study, you see that the architectural language she had developed allowed her to put these things together in a different way than those who were simply doing the specialist measurements, and also connect to those who were in the building and experiencing discomfort. And then a third PhD student from this network, which I found extremely interesting as a separate role. We were already starting, in the last session, we already had, envision the future so that, and then we can make it. Shaping the imagination is so key to what the architect does. And this is just some images of one of the PhDs who built an entire virtual reality experience 3 times in order to show that we have a much more embodied presence in virtual reality and augmented reality than has ever been really acknowledged in any of the academic literature studying virtual reality and augmented reality. Why? Because all of the canonical texts were busy with the gadgets. And she rediscovered a hidden history of female innovators in this period, in the 90s, who were engaging with what the bodily presence in virtual reality meant. Whole new path. So to me, what we do a lot when we're trying to engage with those knowledges that just don't quite fit with our academic structures and our coherent frameworks is that we're trying to demonstrate rather than explicate. A specialist knowledge will go drive right down to the depths and try and pull apart every piece to make us understand what it is that this one molecule, the other molecule is doing. Very valuable knowledge. But if we forget that there's a different level in which we show something that can be immediately perceived, we're also missing a second component. And I just wanted to share this because these were 2 students at the University of Antwerp who spent a full semester making a wordless cookbook. And they actually experimented with the different recipes. I'm just showing one here. And they had their housemates make them with only the instructions you see. Very different products came out of each one. Another important issue in this kind of thinking is not only that you have to demonstrate alongside explicating, but that you become aware, and very aware, that all of this knowledge, that sometimes the most valuable knowledge you have, is partial and not whole. It's not one big coherent framework that we can box in what we know, but you have a moment, you have a connection, there's a question to something you need to achieve with a specific sort of linen, and because of that, you are digging into the 30 rolls of linen that we find here until you tell by the actual feeling of this linen that this is the one that's going to achieve what you need. Does that mean that you have a full knowledge of every form of linen out there? No. Do you have the knowledge for what you need? At this point, yes. And maybe the most important one, which goes probably to this issue of the radically global. This was from a PhD student originally from South Africa who became part of the network. And his work was constantly trying to figure out how to incorporate many knowledges, the many multiple contested, politically charged knowledges that he was dealing with on an everyday basis in his participatory projects. and to begin to create a visual language that it would allow an understanding that there is not one answer. So I present these slides simply as a kind of position statement. Much of the discourse on tacit knowledge has been somewhat skeptical because there's also a kind of fear of returning to a master-student relation where the exclusions become as important as the inclusions, but rather we've been approaching it from this perspective that our students know so much more than they think, and it's in many ways up to us to help unlock that, and then to begin to question openly what these values are that underpin it, why we appeal to a sense of objectivity that many of us teaching already know is constructed, if not downright false. And why should we not then allow students to be part of this journey in beginning to break these open and beginning to really critically assess which parts of their own knowledge can contribute much more to where we need to go as a field. That's it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sophie Pelsmakers. I'm originally from Belgium, so I've come from family visit in Antwerp. And I want to talk about change. And really, I wanted to bring home, and I think this is not new to any of you here present, but I really wanted to bring home that every minute of the day we pollute rivers and the air we breathe, not just us in the built environment, but as a society. And we use resources that we can never again replenish. And of course, it's been very much also the built environment that's been part of irreversibly changing the planet in our very own lifetime as well. And that's because we live in a world where we burn dirty fossil fuels that are now unbearably heating up the very planet that has been sheltering and nurturing humans and other species for millions of years. And I think what's really important, and this is still in practice often ignored and contested, and even sometimes in education as well by our students, that it's ultimately our design choices that we make that directly and indirectly affect ecosystems, people and communities, both locally but also often thousands of miles away. And we do all of that with a stroke of a pen. I come from that period when I was educated, still manual drawing, or of course a click of a mouse now these days. And I think that's really important that we come back to this as well, and that we acknowledge that actually even a lot of the green projects and sustainable projects still are not actually having a neutral impact or even a positive impact. Typically, each single architecture project still has contributed to the problem today, despite everything that we know. So we need to really change how and what we teach. And this is something that I've been working on, thank you for the very kind introduction earlier, for just over 20 years as both a student, then as a teacher, also working in practice as well, and as a researcher now as well. And for me, what I've come to realize, I've written quite a few books that I thought is always, oh, we don't have enough knowledge in practice or in school. That's why we don't know how to make this change. But actually, we've got plenty of knowledge now. And I've come to realize it's really about values and that we need to change our values. So really following on, where are you, Lara? Yeah, very much related to that as well. And we only have 10 minutes, so I had to really be careful what to choose and what to talk about. But one of the things that I think has also really contributed to some of the problems we have in the built environment in architecture is that as architects, we tend to approach design as if we do it for ourselves, for our own portfolio, our own CV, our own career progression. And I think also in the earlier session, this was also mentioned that it's perhaps very different kind of careers. And I kind of hate that word when people ask me about it. Because I think ultimately we serve the public rather than ourselves. And so it's also this intersubjective validation that exists in the architecture community. We think that we decide ourselves what is beautiful or good architecture, but actually it's our whole community that sets the scene and those values. And that has been, no time to talk about it, but that has ultimately really come from modernist times and before. This is knowledge from over 100 years that we still today value. And that was ultimately created by very privileged European men. So that's the knowledge that we still today embed in our teaching. So what do we need to do? I'm acknowledging here my colleague, Kasia, who will talk after me. I has been working on the concept of radical inclusivity with other colleagues. But it's really, so we really need to teach that we design, the students design their projects for radical inclusivity. And I'm sorry, Kasia, if I'm butchering your principle here in this very short time. But it's really about teaching students to not design for their own portfolio, and to really design for what is sort of called by them radical inclusivity. So space for people, but also habitats for nature and non-humans as well, hence the radical inclusivity as well. And so it's about designing high quality, inclusive and universally accessible spaces for all and not just for the well-off, the young, or those that can actually afford to go into the building. And so it really also means that design decisions cannot harm or negatively impact others. So whether that's humans, non-humans, and whether that's locally or globally as well. The second thing that we need to do is we need to teach to collaborate and co-create in design process. And we heard this, I think, a comment from a student in graphic design, also from our colleague Phoebe, I can't quite see, yeah, there you are, as well about these co-creation processes in education as well. Not only do students collaborate with each other, but also this knowledge between the the teacher. It's at a very different kind of level, the way we work, and much more democratic and inclusive. Because ultimately, when we go into practice, this pretension that, and I apologize that I'm being a little bit straightforward and direct in this, but what is this thing with architects' practices all having their own name on it? As if they're the only individual that creates that. Maybe in some time that was the case, but has not been like that for a long, long time. Architecture is super complex. And this idea that it's a one-person pursuit is obviously very wrong. It is ultimately co-created with other experts and stakeholders, ideally also the community, ecologists, city planners, and so on. And we need to really acknowledge that and teach that as well with our students. So ideally, we would actually collaborate across disciplines. This idea that landscape architecture is very separate, when actually in the Nordic countries it's actually part of the education, which has other problems because of the 5-year squeeze, and is not in the EU regulations. So it's usually the thing that's like, well, we can get rid of that if we, there's issues. And the accreditation and so on, but it's really important that we think of this in a different way, and we teach our students these values as well, that it's not this one genius that creates a project. And so really it's about really the skill set that students need to learn is to actively listen to others, to seek out knowledge of others, to collaborate. Also this idea of like the collective knowledge, and is one who is the expert and who actually needs to know things as well. And of course it also means to include and elevate and also marginalized voices as well. Because then when students go into practice, they have these skills to facilitate these conversations with the communities. And that comes back to the changing role of the architect in the current crisis that we have. And so, yeah, so ultimately we know from research, when we design for the most vulnerable, all of us benefit. The third one is that we really need to shift our ethical values and actions in our teaching, in my teaching. And this comes back to very simple things. I don't know when the last time, how many educators are here in the room? Okay, many. Just if you think about it, right? I mean, I'm a professor of housing design. That was my expertise in practice and then also in research. So it's everyday architecture. This is like not single houses. This is multi-story or multi-family housing. But how often in architecture, I actually went through my whole master's at the University of East London. We never designed housing at all. It was all very prestigious buildings and, monumental kind of landmarks. And that already instills a value. When is the last time that in your brief you may have set, and everyday architecture. That's very different from when you set something else in the brief, or who the client is, or who the users are as well. So the brief we set, the language we use. For example, when I went to Sheffield University, coming from East London University, I was asked to attend a review, and I said, "Do you mean a crit?" "Oh, Sophie, we don't call that a crit anymore. We haven't done that for a while." And it's even just the language that you use and how you set up a space completely changes how you teach architecture and the message you instill to the students and how actually that teaching happens in the safe space you create and so on. And then, so all of this, so the methods, the language, the brief we said, they all embed values that we pass on to our students, and then of course in the whole curriculum as well. So yeah, I talked about this. The other thing is also whether it's guidance, tutoring, presentation, and so on. And then of course also the format of reviews. Is it really a case whereby the critics sit up front and critique your work, or is it actually peer related? Or do you as a teacher sit in the back and let the peers first take over and ask probing questions? So all of that actually changes how we teach and how that knowledge can be embedded in very, very different ways. And sort of that tacit knowledge that can come out, because students know so much more than they think they know, as we've heard before. I want to sort of finish on some challenges that I have. I've been now for 5 years at Tampere University. Before that, I was nearly 2 years in Denmark. I Brexited. I was in London, in the UK for 20 years. And so some of the key findings from research on our ArchviChange project was that often teachers think, when we did a survey across 5 institutions in Europe, the teachers think they teach sustainability. The students who responded from those same institutions go, "Yeah, no, that's not taught." Because we often think it's one lecture like this, is passive learning. One lecture and the student is supposed, well, I do give a lecture on circular economy, say, and the student goes, "Well, yeah, I kind of get it, but I don't know how to embed that in my project." So that was the other finding, that there's a big gap for students on how they actually can embed that knowledge into their actual projects, because often that theoretical knowledge, the research, is very separated from an actually the design studio as well. So then we also found that there's a big gap and this is actually very important, that we do have architects from practice that come and teach, but there's also a big gap in pedagogical methods. We tend to teach the way we've been taught, which is very often the master-apprentice model. I'm going to show you. It's passive learning often, or it's sort of through showing by doing. And often in practice, actually, they're much better technically, but they're also, particularly in Finland, then they're very, very focused on, "Oh, you're doing something really radical, but the developer would never pay for that, so don't do it." So that's a real challenge that I have them finding people from practice that actually have this radical view and can separate what happens in practice versus what we need in the future as well. And that comes back also to Sergio's kind of comment or introduction earlier, that architecture is both a professional and an academic qualification, and I find there's a lot of tension between that in pretty much every institution that I've been. And ultimately, we find that for me, with values as well, and then these methods that we described, that's where students learn critical thinking, critical reflection. Being able to make decisions for themselves is more important, and this is still seen controversial in my institution and many others, than learning the latest CAD program. Because that's then seen as employability, but actually it's about how you think, what you use the CAD program for, then you can choose the tool, and then you just learn the tool. It's much more important that you know where to seek that knowledge. So it's really about the attitude to their own learning, and we need active learning methods, so the opposite of what's actually happening here. It's only 10-minute talks. And we then use flipped classrooms. This was already pre-COVID, and then peer-to-peer learning a lot. They're good methods because students then actually work together, but also they have a chance to come prepared to a class. So also, again, is very inclusive as well for people that don't have the first language in which we teach. But people can then come prepared, ask questions, and we set workshops around this and really then activate and go into greater depth together when we're face-to-face as well. And then a lot of this, it's very good for internalizing knowledge, and particularly for transformational learning as well, and questioning and reflecting what it is they do. So very quickly here you can see this is Designing for the Climate Emergency book, and in our 10 themes on ArchviChange, where we try to instill some of that. Just to finish up, I experience as really limited resources for teachers to upskill. We heard that before as well. Also, if you change your curriculum, it's sort of like, okay, like you've been doing that for 20 years, as we heard. Are you really gonna change that. Also different teaching methods, sometimes it's resistance from students. I had a comment that because of the flipped classroom, the professor only gave one lecture face-to-face. And they saw that as a very bad thing. So also very little collaboration, I find. That architects have, we do think we read somebody's book and we're the expert. Quite arrogant, really, instead of actually collaborating with the experts and building on the knowledge that's gone before. So we always tended to start from a base level, and I find that super frustrating because this is urgent, what we're facing, and we don't have time to repeat things from the 1970s that have already shown to not work. The other thing is also when we have a 5-year degree, it means that we can't just change 1 year, everything has to change. And then that's why it's slow. That's why often we do this acupuncture, which is then also problematic because we then don't create this radical shift that we need. And then we still have resistance among teachers, but also still students. They don't see the urgency. They don't have the values that this actually is really important. And what I always say to my students is that in the end, of course, architecture is about art, beauty, how you feel in a space. But in the end of the day, in a 4 degrees Celsius world, architecture and art ain't gonna matter. We're talking from Rotterdam. I think you might go underwater by the end of the century. So it's really about, it's not an opt-in anymore. And I think we tend to forget that as well when people talk about these aspects. And I think that was all from me. Thank you.
Okay, let's do this. I'm going to throw you through that, all right?
Yeah, these are the hidden slides.
This is the,
Yeah, you're going to go through.
this is the epilogue. This is the epilogue. Okay. No worries.
Sorry. Or they should have been hidden. Keep going, Kasia.
Yeah. Okay. My name is Kasia Nawratek. I am from Manchester School of Architecture, and before I take you on a little journey, I would like to tell you a little bit about the context that I operate. So in Manchester we have 8 ateliers. So ateliers are vertical teaching structures which comprise of year 3 undergraduate, the final year 3, and then 2 masters. And then in my case, that's also a group of landscape architecture students. That's 90 students, 10 members of staff, and I lead one of those. It's called Some Kind of Nature. And in Manchester, each atelier has its own profile. So we actually are struggling to finally, I think we finally, after 3 years of running this, we finally found our identity, because in the beginning everybody said, okay, Some Kind of Nature are about sustainability, and we're like, no, we're not, because every single atelier is sustainable by definition, so we cannot be special because it means that nobody else is doing it, which is not true. So we were looking for identity, and I think we found it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit how it happened, but before we get there, I'm going to take you on a little journey. I would like you to imagine something for me. Can you imagine a child, being a child, that is roaming the city? You are unsupervised. You are alert and present because you're a child, so you're still kind of figuring out how to move around. It also feels a bit subversive because you're not supervised, so you might be exploring spaces that you're not allowed to. You're also resilient because of that. You also feel very connected, maybe to your, fellow feral kids, and and also everything that lives around you. You're very curious and you're free. So this is an experience from my childhood. I grew up in Poland, in the post-industrial city of Katowice. This is massive, big, very urbanized, but also incredibly green, particularly in the 80s when everything collapsed, the industry collapsed, the cities became even greener. A lot of heavy industry closed, but then the nature started taking over. So in the 80s, like, nobody really cared what children were doing, so we were completely free to explore. And this is something that I kind of discovered that is really important experience for me, like one of the formative experiences of my childhood. And then I wrote a book, This is a children's book, so this is I'm taking you on another journey. This is my personal journey. I'm an architect, I'm an educator, I'm also a writer, so I write for young adults and for kids, so this is my previous book, and I use that experience of a child roaming the city freely, which is quite interesting because the book is kind of set up as contemporary, but I'm actually writing about kids in the 80s, whereas contemporary kids still could connect to this, which I find quite curious. And then this experience of being in the city, with the city, and exploring it, and also experiencing nature in a very interesting way. It's not the kind of wild, unspoiled nature, it's the accidental nature, something that just happened. I think that is really, really something that I took forward. And then now I talk about it confidently. I hope I'm coming across that I'm very confident. In reality, I had no idea that what I was doing. And at the same time, as I was writing, I was also teaching in architecture schools in the UK, and then I realized that what I write about, my creative writing practice, and what I teach in architecture, this doesn't really work, because I have to be much more aware of the context, and I also have to think about my role as an architect. How do I stay connected with what's there, with the city space, with all those players, human and non-human? And how do I position myself in the process? If I come from that, very traditional, and then this is how I was taught also, master-apprentice model as well, and also, name on the door as the goal in your life. If you're professionally successful, that's what you end up with your name on the door. So then I thought, well, this doesn't really work. I have to change the way I think. And I did. And I was at Sheffield University, and then I ran a master studio for a year, which kind of completely, I rebuilt the way I think, I rebuilt the way I teach, and I started thinking about, okay, so if I'm looking at the context, and if I'm including humans, but if I'm also including non-humans in the way I think, I started looking into literary theory and also philosophy. So Mihaly Bakhtin and his idea of polyphony comes here. And so this, just very briefly about polyphony, if you're not familiar, this is exactly what it is. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's a term borrowed from music, and it means multiple voices together. But the really interesting thing about this concept is this is not about harmony. This is about allowing all voices to be there and take space. And what I'm really interested in is that what happens when you identify conflict. I find conflict as a really great design driver. I'm not asking my students or myself to find a solution to kind of make that, unison, beautiful, harmonic thing. That's impossible and really arrogant if you think about it. I'm asking them, can you identify a conflict between different voices? Work with that, understand the situation, listen to it, and then come up with not a solution, but a response. Again, Sophie mentioned change of language. I don't even like the word review here. So I would say, thinking about not solutions, but responses. And exploration, a journey is more important for, particularly in the education process, than setting up the destination. And suddenly, by doing this, without knowing, I found myself there in the front row, at the same table, with people who were wearing the badge of sustainability. I was like, okay, this is where I am. Because then I realized that there is so much writing. I mean, obviously, I'm making a story for you, but obviously being aware of, Donna Haraway, being aware of Rossi Braidotti, being aware of Anat Singh, for example. So suddenly I started reading about this, and I realized, okay, my theoretical roots, if I start tracing them, if I start positioning myself, this is posthumanism, but particularly feminist thought. This is where I fit, this is where I belong, this is where I'm coming from, really. This is the way I think. So, and that's our take, our atelier's take on the sustainable approach. We take the post-human approach to this, which is again rooted in the feminist theory. And in the end, I mean, maybe not in the end, it's still a process. I think that I always thought that I teach my students a way of thinking, that I'm giving them tools how to deal with the world. That's what I thought. And then I realized, no, actually, that's not what I'm doing. This is actually a way of being in the world. This is so much more than the way you think. Because then when you start thinking in this particular way, it starts to change the way you are in the world. And then, again, kind of, framing it from a feminist perspective. So world is not there to be conquered. It is there to be with it. And also to be constantly in awe of its infinite complexity and its feeling keen to others. I think you can start kind of tracing those thoughts, to those writers that I just mentioned. And that agenda, that position is, in my opinion, incredibly powerful. It allows you to be imaginative, it's curious, and it's joyful, and it's hopeful, and I think that's what we really need. So in a way, what I would say that my position as an architectural educator is also an ethical stance. So again, it's more than a way of thinking. It is a way of being with the world. I think that's it. That's the end. Yes, thank you.
It's not on? Yeah, it's fine. Oh, you hear me, right? Or not?
No. I think it's on, but you have to keep it closer.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so as I was saying before, very compelling, very provocative statements to start our conversation. And like I said also in my opening statement, it sounds like all of you are proposing a much more broader understanding of what architectural knowledge is via education. So what are the tools that you are developing? I mean, we've heard already a bit about your specific tools, but how do we go from a way of thinking to a way of being? How does that look like?
That's really you, right? Thinking.
Yeah, I can
but
feel that.
also for you.
Is that one? Yeah, okay, cool. How do you make it happen? Gradually, slowly, you need time. I think that rushing anything in education is a mistake. And I think people need to be first exposed to ideas, that they need to kind of sit with them, and then they internalize them by doing something with them. So it's a long process. And I think just kind of, if I am in a very lucky and privileged situation, the moment I stand in front of my students and I say, welcome to SKN, welcome to some kind of nature, I can see majority of people being like, yes, let's do it. This is where I belong. This is going to be great. So I don't have to fight that. I have them on all board. I have 10 members of staff, across from architecture, landscape architecture practitioners, academics. Everybody's on board, doing really interesting things. So I think that kind of, the moment they come in, they're already primed to be there. I think it's a different challenge if that's not the case. But how does that happen? With everything, with literally every single thing you do in the studio. But I think the language here is incredibly important. How do you position the project? Again, for me, it's not a solution. It's always a response. Just start with that.
Maybe, some of it maybe is also highlighting moments when you feel that the students are falling into the kind of classic knowledge models. One thing I remember particularly from 2 years ago, we were reading this incredibly beautiful philosophical book on being in the city called City Living. And I had 3 students in class say, but is this actually research? And I said, well, why not? But it's so easy to read. At that moment, we sat down and we had a good hour-long talk about whether language needed to be obtuse, difficult, incomprehensible to be actual academic research, or whether you could actually find knowledge, value, understanding in something that you might read on a Friday afternoon.
And what happens when that type of knowledge is not made available? Because implicit in your story, there's also some sort of resistance to understanding knowledge in different ways, or knowledge that appears in a different form that is, in this case, expected by students.
Yeah, that's true. This goes to that occasional resistance you have from students who, you know, have taken on a very serious study, and they're wondering if really your encouragement of their making a languageless cookbook is in line with the kind of serious study. I think that's when time comes in. I encourage them to go down the path, to think about it, to reflect on it with each other also. And so I think as time progresses, their resistance falls away from sheer enjoyment and engagement with what they're doing.
Yeah, I want to second that. I mean, I agree with both of you as well. Like this idea of a way of being and our positioning is so important. And I think that also sets an example, right? And if it's about broadening, I also think what's important is about holistic. It's not just only about energy and carbon or only social aspects. We need to do all of that. And I think that's where we need time, and also the idea that we don't have to do it in each single studio project or each single year. We have 5 years to do this, and we often forget that as well. And then I also think that what I find is that the more colleagues approach education in a more democratic and collaborative way, and with this tacit knowledge and giving the students space to discuss, space to think with each other, with us, then actually becomes much easier. Like we're at the moment, I mean, there's sort of seeds being planted, and a lot of the younger teachers are using a lot of this as well. And it's an amazing when students come to you and you have less resistance and already more used to those ways of working. And it's a bottom-up request, which is amazing, because then they suddenly go, why are we still doing this old-fashioned way of learning? But that takes time as well for the institutional values to change and that to take off.
Yeah, well, because with the broadening of knowledge also comes a redefinition of the expertise. What do we expect of architects? I mean, we also heard in the previous session that what we are teaching today, the present that we exist today, is not what we are going to encounter in the future. So how can we change that? How can we break this sort of vicious cycle in which we are constantly trying to teach for the present, the AutoCAD that is required, or whatever CAD it is? How do we break that vicious cycle, and we are empowering students and ourselves to imagine the future in which these new professionals will engage with?
Okay, I'm going to say that we just don't teach that. Just go rogue. It's like, okay, I'm going to just, be super controversial, but also, it's a bit in a jokey way. But we all function within, all our educators function within very rigid institutional, scaffolding. We cannot really move that much, particularly in professionally accredited courses. It's just incredibly hard. I have 3 accreditation bodies that basically are constantly trying to meddle with what I do. And I think that I'm super, super lucky, because if I say that in our atelier we do things in a certain way because it comes from our ethos and this is how we perceive things, we are not going to be putting much pressure on those, let's say, digital skills, because we see them only as Sophie earlier explained. So I am able to also set out my own outputs. So I'm asking my students this year in the final year of masters to create one of the stages everybody has to produce a model of a spatial representation of their explorations. It doesn't, I'm not saying this has to be that scale or another, but it has to be spatial and it has to be somehow connected to what you're doing. And I think so by just saying that has to be a physical model. Just by doing this, obviously I'm going to pull them away from doing everything in CAD. Even if they do use some digital methods to make that model, that's great. But it's still going to be a tangible thing that they're going to have to somehow assemble with their own hands.
Yeah, I think like the explaining the new methods that you use, we found that as well. Initially we didn't do it, you had more resistance, and they were like, why? All the other courses, and actually even on some of the theory courses, they just want to come attend, passively learn, hand in an essay, and then they come to my theory course and it's flipped classroom and workshops. and discussion. And they're like, I have to actually be present. Can't I even just sit in online? And no, you have to be present. And then actually sort of they overcome then, but you then explain why you do these things. And I think that's really important. And then, as you also say, the language. And I also think everything that we do is setting these values. And it also means that we might invite people that have nothing to do with architecture to come and talk about their area of expertise. And sort of also we have those discussions around what is it to be an architect and allowing space. And that's where also the slowness comes in. Allowing space. So in a way, often our briefs, we ask them to do a lot less, but to do it in depth, do it really well. So they can go into depth. And I think that's what we found, so they can really probe deeper and feel that they have expertise, but also acknowledging their own expertise and their everyday lived experiences, right? And I always call it like we're ultimately all global citizens, and we need to take that hat with us to architecture school and to architecture practice, and not sort of go, well, I'm vegan, or I don't cycle, I only cycle, I don't drive or fly anywhere, and then suddenly we go into the architect's office, or they're a parent, and they forget all these things as a designer, and they become the concrete designer with these values that don't carry through. So as being that global citizen and taking that through as well, I think is really important.
No. Okay. Well, the two things that I wanted to pick up from that, one is, what does it mean to be an expert in architecture today? Or perhaps what does it mean to be an expert in architecture in the future? Because you pointed out that you bring in the expertise from, let's say, other types of knowledge or other forms of knowledge, and that they have the possibility to contribute to the formation or the education of future architects. So what would be, for the three of you, in fact, what would be the necessary expertise and skills that an architect should have in the future?
Can I start?
You start again.
Okay. I think that what we bring to the table as architects, and it's not changing, regardless of the tools we use, digital, handcrafted, doesn't matter. It's the understanding that architecture is spatial, is situated, it's contextual. So, and then we have that unique ability to map things out into space, processes in particular. So our expertise always lies in understanding space and how it works. With people, with goods, with humans, non-humans, living and non-living entities like air, water, and so on, and energy as well. And then when we understand that this is our superpower, that ability to put things into space and map it and understand them, not only in space, but also, again, in time, it doesn't matter what tools we're going to be using, because there's going to be always a combination of various tools, depending on which part of the process we're dealing with. But that unique thing of understanding space and time, in a way, is what is our superpower. So in a way, to me, it doesn't matter. It's to make students aware that this is what we do, and then they will find their own way in the future how they will apply that understanding and what tools they will be using to actually convey that, explore that, and communicate that. But we don't know those tools yet, so.
But do you also not think we need to have a discussion? I mean, you might have this as well about what does it mean to be an architect. I think there's sort of, and particularly in the UK, there's this sort of straitjacket of RIBA Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, director of a firm, have name on the door, as you said. And I think that's actually really problematic, because it doesn't do justice to the skill set that actually architects have and can use. Like, we need more people as developers, as city planners, as decision makers, politicians, and I also think facilitators of these processes that you described, not only designing buildings, and then there's the caretaking we heard earlier, or the maintenance of buildings, and do buildings work in reality or spaces. So I think it's much, much broader, yet on the whole, we tend to design, that's at least my experience over the last 25 years, for buildings, new buildings mostly as well. And that's also, I think, really problematic.
Yeah, but I think it also, at least in our faculty, it comes in a lot in the theory courses where there are just discussions about what it might mean, but there are also simple questions to the students, what they expect. And a surprising number of my students do not expect to go into practice and do not expect to be having their own office. But then it becomes a more interesting conversation of, what it means to contribute. And there I do hear the frictions of what's placed on them by others in terms of being, you know, the visionary or having the office, etc. But I have a remarkable number of students that might say something about the ones that come to me, or about my teaching, but a remarkable number that depart to shape and be in the world in different ways.
The ones that make cookbooks without words, right? Well, I appreciate your response, but I meant more in terms of the conceptual and the theoretical tools that are required. So again, perhaps I'm just going back to the first question, is like, how do you go from thinking to being?
But that one I'll jump in on for a minute,
Okay.
because that to me is, I mean, and that word has come up a few times over the first session and this one, it's really much more about attitudes. So to me, I really do try not necessarily to give my students knowledge, you know, this kind of classical model, but to help train them to think. Contingencies, flexibility, generosity, open listening, you know, these kinds of things I think are almost the basic toolbox I would probably see as more important now than any kind of knowledge we can transfer.
Yeah, I totally agree, because it's also then they know what to do with that knowledge. You know, once they're a critical thinker, they can adapt to the situation. What you said, they, you know, part knowledge we have, right, is for that time, you know, about the linen cloth. And I think that's, it's a different way of approaching, but it's also different pedagogies for that reason. So it's not that sort of passive transfer of me, the master, to the apprentice. It's co-created, and sort of different approaches to it, I think, is really important. And that then instills the values as well. So I would totally agree with what you described. The attitude, yeah.
No. Yeah. Well, in continuity with this, there's something that has caused me a bit of pause or sort of a bit of wondering, which is what type of worldviews or what type of values come along with a changing attitude. And in continuity with that, then what are we losing when we are broadening, and what are we gaining? And how do we even understand that? Or is this the wrong way to understand it?
You saw me stop when you said losing.
It was intentional.
I was looking up. I was like, are we losing?
No, if you think in practical terms, you've already referred to this, which is in 5 years, maybe we are skipping this because it doesn't fit the accreditation or whatnot. So in some instances, due to the lack of time, and the time has already been mentioned a couple of times, due to lack of time, it ends up being a matter of choices. What do you do instead of that?
But you could also question, what are some of the things we teach? Are they still necessary? And it also comes back to then the approach, right? When we teach history and theory, is it really the traditional way of how it's taught? We heard quite a lot today about the masters, and I don't refer to the buildings that way anymore. When I look at them now and I understand the impact they've had, of course I appreciate them for that time and the technical innovation and so on. But ultimately, when you understand the impact they have, you look at it very differently. And we need to teach, I think, history and theory in very different ways because of this. And I know there's several in the room who are doing that very much, yeah. So I think it's those aspects, and I don't see that as losing. This is actually already, we should have been doing that 20 years ago and reframing that knowledge, I think. So for me, it's only gaining, but it does require more of us as educators, or as a collective, rather. And I also think it requires more of architects, but again, as a collective. It doesn't have to mean that one individual holds that knowledge or pretends to hold that knowledge. And I think that's also something we're not very good at as architects. It's still very individual, and the individual genius or the individual project, you know. And I think that's also these values that are very in tension then with actually what is needed, which is, I think, is much more collective based, what we need. And I don't see that as losing anything. I know that a lot of colleagues in Finland and even young architects bemoan the loss of power of the architect. And I'm always thinking, but that was never the power we should have had. That was never our power. So that's also problematic, I think, as well. But again, I think it comes back from these old values from the modernist times that we've been carrying forward in education, in architecture practice, of what those values are, that actually are no longer fit for purpose and haven't been for quite some time, a lot of those.
So what do we do? What's the future of education?
Throw everything out we know and no.
I think that it's not just that the world is changing, but the young people that are coming to university are changing.
Yeah.
And I think you can tell that difference, that, you know, like if you've been teaching long enough, you can see how the attitudes change. And I think that there is something really I noticed the last couple of years, is that kind of calmness about the students, and a very sober, approach to what's going on. They don't remember anything different than just, ongoing crisis. And then in a way they kind of took a very stoic, perspective on this. And I think that's very healthy in a way. And I think that, maybe that's what we really should do. This is how we should think. If you kind of, stop for a minute and realize that humanity, as we know it, is just a blip in the history of this planet. I've had a project a couple of years ago, which was the building that was supposed to stay there after we're gone. Just to kind of, of a reminder to whoever's going to come next, or from wherever. There was this calm acceptance that might happen. Because, there is this interesting theory that, we might not be the only, intelligent life on this planet, but they just didn't leave any traces. It's very, very compelling if you think about it. What if we speculate for a moment and think like, okay, what happens if we disappear? And then, with time, there is enough time. There is enough time for new thinking, intelligent life to emerge and build its civilization. What would it be? What would they find, us, by? And then I can give you an answer. Plastic, nuclear waste, and chicken bones. That's apparently what we're leaving behind at this point. So just kind of, thinking that maybe being alarmist, maybe being super stressed, that's really not the answer. Maybe kind of taking things in perspective. But I think it's kind of being quietly hopeful. Maybe that's a good approach.
But I also think it's important to, like, sort of with this loss, right? If we don't change what we're doing, because the built environment is responsible, if we then talk about energy and carbon, for like more than a third of the CO2 emissions in Europe, we cannot have a clean world unless that we also, fix the built environment. And if we don't actually fix what we're doing, not only is architecture irrelevant, but this is a huge, huge issue. And then we are talking about a world with no butterflies, bees, birds. Like, there's only stuff to gain, having clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and so on. Of course, then we look at what's going on in the world and wars and so on, and then that also gives you a perspective of how big our task is aside from the built environment. But that shouldn't be like every single degree Celsius we save is so important, but also every single person that is included and isn't marginalized matters so much. But I just don't think we have enough of these discussions across the whole. There's certain courses that have it, but not across the whole spectrum of it. And I think that's why it's so important having that worldview of, and coming back to the question of hope earlier. I sort of have this notion that I think it's too late to do anything, but I'm also hopeful because the planet will still be here. Whether we as humans survive in the current quality of life, no, probably. But other species will thrive and the planet will still exist. Nature will be different, and that's hopeful in that sense, even in a depressing way. But
yes, in a very
I actually
way,
think it's really important that we also realize the importance of that we're such a big part of the problem. We have to be part of that solution as well in those discussions. And that starts from year one, where we change the values, I think, already. And because, as you said, the young kids come to school, but there's something that happens by the time they're in year 3, because they lose that enthusiasm or that energy, I think, in a lot of places. Their hope or that passion that they have to make the world a better place suddenly becomes, what does it mean to be an architect? I need to do drawings of a certain kind to fit in. And I think we need to have much more discussions around and the learning outcomes and how we assess work. I mean, that's a whole different discussion, and less about sort of like, oh, I really like that project, therefore let's give it a top mark, versus actually, does it meet the learning outcomes of having no impact, being radically inclusive? And then I can give a top mark to a project I think kind of looks weird, but that's also the point. It's a new kind of architecture. And maybe just to finish my rambling, we've now in Tampere University, this is a bit experimental, all our courses have turned into pass-fail only. We do not give grades, with the idea that people are less competitive when we do peer-to-peer learning, so they're more sharing with the methods we have, but also that they actually can be more creative and take risks in a good way, experiment more, I'll report back in a few years how that's going. They only get pass-fail, so they don't get like people would really strive for like we have 1 to 5 marks. This is the other strange thing in Finland, but yeah. So we no longer have that. This is the first year that all the courses, even master's level, are now also the master's thesis are pass-fail.
So maybe just before I open up to the audience, just to ask you very specific, in what specific ways, what type of experiments have you tried in your own institutions that may or may not have resulted in progress? Is that part of the future?
I set up I'm one of the 3 co-founders of the atelier, but I think that the one piece of information that I can add to this is that the 3 people who founded this was an architect, myself, a social scientist specializing in flood response by communities, and a landscape architect. And I think that ethos of this working across disciplines and then learning languages, which came up today earlier, I think that was really important. And then what also happened is that the colleague who was a social scientist we created a role in the school of a sustainability coordinator for the whole school. So I think that's something really fantastic, because then she has insight into every single module, every single course, and is known and present across the school as someone who coordinates everything we do around those issues. So.
But that also becomes a way of embedding that type of knowledge across the school,
yes.
Not just, as you said before, you're not just the sustainability studio.
Exactly.
Every single studio is intended to be sustainable.
Yes, it is, and in every single brief in undergrad, every single brief has 2 parts that are compulsory for each atelier to fill in, which is, and I think masters as well actually. It says, how's your atelier responding to, our climate crisis, and how are you defining inclusivity, and how do you implement this? So every single brief will have to have that. So, but it also makes things difficult for us as an atelier, because then we have to find, a way how to distinguish ourselves for just being, the sustainable one.
Lara?
I think I'm ready. They're all like small things, and I'm not sure that I have like a nice one to complement.
Non-nice ones are also interesting. But small things cumulative steps lead to large change.
I do. Hopefully yes. But it is, these institutions are oil tankers, and we have little rowboats, and so as we kind of row them off by half a degree, I guess that's some change.
We will see in 5 years, right? So maybe this is a good time.
Share?
Yes, of course.
I think that you can do a lot by being subversive as an educator. At least in Finland as well, I get trusted to teach. The bits that haven't worked is when I've been getting really frustrated that we have so many meetings about we need to change and nothing changes, and then I've learned that actually I can make a change in my own corner. I don't have to wait for permission. I also made the mistake of, there was originally when I arrived, there was a lot of architects with big names who worked at big architect practices, rehiring them because that was a collegiate thing to do, but then they didn't match this value change and these attitudes that we were trying to convey, and so there was a huge disconnect between what we asked students to do and the teachers that could deliver it. So what has worked is young people. They're all super, super young people. Just out of university, not always from my master's thesis, just, people that actually really believe and understand these values, and I think that's really important as well. And then the third thing this is reflected also in the last book that I then wrote, which is then really about setting out for every student what to do at different steps and how to embed sustainability and holistic aspects in their projects, is that for ages you think you teach it passively, or you give a lecture or you do something and students know. But you need to actually follow up with how do you now use it in your project. You can't just leave it. So you need specific learning activities to embed that. And I think often a lot of us make these mistakes that we don't follow through with the knowledge we have. So we need to broaden that discussion as well.
Okay, great.
So the shift from knowing to understanding.
Yeah, and integrating.
Yeah. Yes, coming your way. Get some movement.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm wondering if there's an opportunity within the curriculum to, because of course you need certain hard skills when you're in the practice. So I'm wondering if you can use studios and sort of the slots of time within their day where they can explore these transdisciplinary, inclusive ideas, and then maybe they have little pockets of like the necessary skills, like AutoCAD, whatever, SketchUp, whatever. If they're learning these things just as sort of a means to an end, because of course graphic representation is important, whether it's manual or digital or whatever, but just learning them in small little snippets and then exercising the big thoughts and crossing the big ideas in the studios, in the ateliers. What do you think? Do you see that as a way forward, or do you see it as sort of repeating the same issues that we've had in the past?
So if I understand the question, it's somehow between a new method, using the tools in order to find an entry point for the larger systemic questions.
For me, it's a question of logistics. So in year 3, which is the lowest level that I teach in the atelier, students have already done 2 years. And skills, digital skills particularly, are a separate module. This is not part of the studio teaching, it's taught separately. And then we have quite strong expertise in the school with that. So, if there are any specific questions, I can even send students and say, look, you need to talk to Jason, because Jason knows everything about GIS, and then you need this in your project, so you talk to him. So that's, for me, is a question of logistics. But I think that the answer I would give is that you can always set up a task. Let's say, how do you identify yourself within the atelier agenda? Can you express that through a particular type of work that requires certain skill? So then the skill is not the end of itself, but you use it to express something, some sort of idea or deeper thinking. Does that make sense? So tools are tools, never something that you do.
Not a means to an end,
exactly,
right?
yeah.
They're a tool as part of the process.
The reason why I asked it is because you named it as one of the things that students are driving to learn, that it's taking sort of a big chunk of their brain power when they should be focusing on these broader ideas and critical thinking. So that's why it triggered something in me that, it's not really that important. These bigger ideas are more important. So I was wondering if you saw that in your own experience, that they're focusing too much on these skills rather than these
Can I jump
thinking.
in here? Because that part of that goes to this RIBA exam, the professional qualifications. This is something in Flanders has been going on for a while now, a discussion also with the architects registry, whether the management skills or the specific drawing skills, which ones need to be part of the accreditation. So this is, I think, where, maybe that's the kind of underground experiment we do. We push back a lot at the professional organizations, and we discuss this a lot internally because we also have a very young faculty. And we constantly notice that the requests being put on us from the qualification institutions are not at all in line with what the younger faculty feels is relevant. So this is definitely one of those parts of the process.
Yes, coming your way.
While Saskia is going there, how do you see then the model that you ask students to do? Is that not some sort of tool to reflect the thinking that they are doing in the studio, but in architectural terms, in spatial terms?
Yeah, well, this is this is set up in the final year of masters, and this is after 7 weeks of learning. I'm asking them to specify the issue of interest / a research question. I'm also asking them to explore the atelier theoretical agenda and come up with a methodology that they're going to use in the project. And one of the outputs, so they're going to be documenting the process. I'm actually facilitating workshops that are going to help them, formulate that. And one of the outputs is a model at the end, because I want them to always create while they think. So I'm just kind of directing that to the person who was asking the question.
That's why I brought it up.
Yeah, there's a question here.
More than a question, is more a feedback, because I'm really triggered by your presentation about your passionate criticism to traditional teaching. And it's something also that I'm also an educator in urbanism, and it's something that we discuss very often also with colleagues, actually, that we are aware that we have to change our way of teaching, and then trying to be as much as possible inclusive of the students in the process and all the things that we have heard before about collaboration, etc. But I also notice myself that there is a very thin boundary between including the students and then losing the credibility in front of the students. And I guess you understand what I mean without going further into that. And many times this becomes an issue for us as educators, because I even hear from the students that they don't want that level of inclusion, and that they want to learn because they are not prepared to be considered as much as possible, so much as colleagues, you know. So they lose this sort of trust feeling in us as educators. So I wanted to know what you think about it, because as an educator, it's something extremely recurrent in my practice on a daily basis.
I mean, my experience, I don't know about other colleagues here, is that that's also a transition phase. That as they get to know a different way of working and hearing their voice, that actually first it feels very unfamiliar, they're not sure, the credibility issue might come up with some students. But then actually once they understand and that you become the facilitator of the conversation, and that you guide and give workshops, and you know, then that suddenly shifts back again, and they really massively value that. And they also see you different. I'm known as a bit of an activist, apparently, and I'm like, really? I don't go and stand on the... I'm not a member of any activist group. But so it shifts also. And it is also a big shift in yourself as a teacher as well, when then you might get students challenging you in different ways, and it does require a different skill set. But one other thing I'd say to this as well, and Felicity Adekpe's work at UCL, the Bartlett, she's the head of Par 3 there. Her research is actually also referring to this inclusivity is not only good for everybody, but actually it really supports a lot of students as well that don't come from non-European backgrounds in European education, because they have a voice. Their projects are discussed in a different ways with their peers, and then also from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So these aspects that we're learning, what we have also known, and I have a PhD student in this, that we thought this is how you teach sustainability. That's how we ended up with these results. It was how do you best teach sustainable architecture? And then we realized that's how you just best teach any subject, not just sustainable architecture, because of the huge benefits. But it's that perception that we have and that students have that we need to overcome. And the more courses I do, the more teachers do, you change the values and the attitudes of the whole institution. And that's what's the tanker or the boat, the ship that we're trying to turn around that's so slow. It's frustratingly slow.
Shall we do one more? Yeah, yes.
Am I the last one? Yes. If there are others... Okay, but I have a question. If we want to change the tanker in another direction, which I think is really interesting, then I observe in many universities where I go also as a crit in these juries, final juries, diploma juries, that the project, the architectural project, in whatever form, is replaced by the process. And I see very interesting processes, participatory processes, processes on resources, on energy, on money. But sometimes there is no project anymore. And I was wondering if you could speculate a bit on this. Is this good? Is it an interesting direction? Is this direction of our oil tanker or the tanker? Or is it something that we all maybe are losing and should regretfully examine?
Can I just have one simple response to that? I do think that shows you the changing role of the architect, that it's not solely building, but it's a facilitator of processes, and it shifts actually the skill set, but also what we do. And some will be creating still buildings or transformation of existing, but it shows you the shift that is happening in our field and what needs to happen in the profession. That's personally, like I was educated, and for a long time I was educating thinking architecture means building, or something spatial or something that exists, that didn't exist before. I am not so sure that is. I know actually that's not the case anymore, the role of the architect.
Yes. Yes, actually, I wanted to, while I talk, I'll speak that one of the curators, Noortje Wening, she actually brought in two of these projects that one deal with this question of the cooperation, like how does the architect respond to that, and the other one is a project in Uruguay where people actually don't have the means to build their own house, but they have two hands, and the architect just becomes a sort of sonographer together with an engineer, just to make it concrete that it actually also leads into different typologies of sorts. Is it still architecture?
Exactly.
I don't know. We'll talk about that over drinks, but the last question is for you.
Yeah, I was wondering, maybe is it not about the definition of architecture? Because we keep on talking about architecture as building, but architecture is about void. Architecture is about emptiness. Maybe we have to start realizing that when we design a building, we actually shape what is the surrounding, and that maybe it's not about that composition or beauty. They are values that are less important, because beauty is still part of perception, is still that connection that Lara was talking about. But maybe it's about realizing that if we start by, I don't know, thinking and creating and shaping the beauty of the void, somehow there will be a beauty created that actually has as a result positive habitat for men and for humans and non-humans. So at least this is my very ideal.
It's a follow-up question, or because that's really the last.
It's a kind of follow-up. We come from landscape side, let's say. What is actually crucial for us is that sometimes it happens that we feel that architects are not doing their job somewhat. We are losing the fact of doing architecture, and they are moving, for example, very much to landscape side, which is fantastic for us. But who is teaching architecture anymore? I think they are heroes somewhat.
Okay. Does one of the students want to react? Why is always the last hand on the other side of the room?
It's like my text files. Final.
There we go.
Okay, thanks for running to me. Thanks for giving me the chance to speak a second time. Very quickly, I can relate to non-grading. I come from I still study at the VDK, Willem de Kooning Academy here in Rotterdam. Some of them are here today, so it works, like just giving a pass or no pass, or it helps you focusing on the work. I can relate to that. And also learning attitudes instead of hard skills also works for me. I'm actually glad to have learned those things, because you just focus on what matters instead of I can do it or not. And then I just can relate to this, and I won't ask my last question because we had...
Because of time. Maybe then I can reintroduce this notion of the pre-last question, which was about the void. So maybe the public in public space, or what binds it all together, or does that resonate with anybody?
I think that this is a really fantastic way of putting this. The way I interpret this to my students, again, I'm coming back to this idea that buildings are not static things. If you look at the building, in time, it actually has, it's this thing that kind of reaches to the past, but also reaches to the future, and it changes. It constantly changes. And I always I kind of want to do this quick workshop sometime, do like a death certificate of a building. Like how would you write an obituary to a building to a local paper? And I think that's for me, again, this really comes down to this understanding, and this is really, coming back to your question. I don't want to lose that end thing, because I really believe in craft. The craft is changing, but I think that we still talk about built environment, we still talk about environment in general, and again, our superpower as architects is that understanding of spatial aspects of what buildings and other structures do with time, with people, with everything else.
And then communicating it to show that vision that everybody wants, that world that you reimagined.
Hallelujah. Yes, please give it up for Cassia, Sophie, Laura, and a marvelous introduction and moderation by Sergio. I will just keep on going for 2 seconds. We started 10 minutes late, so I apologize on everybody who wanted to get a drink earlier. There was a little bit of, let's say, rigid understanding of hospitality. That said, the bar is open now for all of you on ours. We, of course, cordially invite you to stay for the 3rd session. For those of you who can't or would like a grab a bite, the Witte de Witstraat has a sort of decent, quick food. But first, let's share a drink and share some conclusions of the first 2 panels. The selfie moment, of course. Thanks for being here. Hope to see you at... Oh. Stay. I hope to see you in 1.5 hours. Ciao.
Pause between the night, the yawning of the dawn, kissing the darkness with its light.